Welcome everybody to ASPI and the launch of the International Cyber Policies Centre's flagship publication. This is the fourth year that the Centre has produced this report, Cyber Maturity in the Asia-Pacific region. It is an absolutely mammoth task involving months and months of research, and it drew in about half a dozen team members. When I first joined ASPI 6 months ago with no team in place, I really wondered how on earth we were going to get this done. And I also asked myself whether it was worth the huge amount of effort. As I've thought through that and met with people around the world who use it regularly, my response has been a resounding yes. And I hope after reading this year's report, you'll agree with me. At one level, the report is a Wikipedia page for each country in our region and the steps they've taken to improve their cyber maturity. It lets you dive in and quickly get up to speed on a year's worth of cyber developments. When you know how much effort goes into producing a single country profile, you get a sense of how much value that must add to people in this field, and I think it explains why this is our single most downloaded publication. At another level, the report offers a template for cyber engagement with countries across our region. At a glance on page 14, you'll see where each country's strengths and weaknesses lie and the opportunities to engage with them. And it also plays a role at the policy-making level. The report feeds into an annual UN index on global cybersecurity, and it's used by regional organisations to monitor best practices among states, helping to drive better policies across the board. And the fact that it's an annual report allows you to monitor progress over time. So I have to say an enormous thank you to everyone who had a hand in producing this report. Tom Uren did an absolutely first-class job of leading the production of this report. He was very ably supported by colleagues Fergus Ryan, Michael Chi, Eliza Chapman, Jack Viola, and really, really grateful and sincerely thank you for the huge amount of effort that you put in to doing that. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. Without their help, this report would be impossible. Telstra, Thales, Alda, Jacobs, and since the report went to print, Google and the Commonwealth Bank. Now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, the Prime Minister's Special Advisor on Cybersecurity, Alistair MacGibbon. Alistair leads the implementation of the government's cybersecurity strategy and has an incredibly impressive background that clearly gives him a very rich experience to draw upon. He was Australia's first e-safety commissioner, founding director of the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre. He's worked in the private sector, including in senior positions with eBay, and in academia as Director of the Centre for Internet Safety. But having had the opportunity to work with Alistair a little bit in my role here, I think even more telling than his work experience is his outlook and his approach. For a leader of a pioneering new sector, you couldn't ask for a better pick. He has a real Renaissance outlook, willing to openly explore new ideas. He's prepared to take risks and take on cyber challenges where the community is still feeling its way. And perhaps most importantly, he has the energy and the enthusiasm to get things on the ground and to bring others along with him on the way. In Plutarch's History of Athens, he likens, I studied the classics and everyone said I wasn't going to get a job, so I always take the opportunity to reference ancient Greece. He likens the limits of exhaustive historical research to the practice of geographers describing the then limits of the known world. And it reminds me of cyberspace. He says, you know, Socius, how geographers, when they come to deal with those parts of the earth which they know nothing about, crowd them into the margins of their maps with the explanation, beyond this lie sandy, waterless deserts, full of wild beasts, or trackless swamps, or Thician snows, or ice-locked sea. And to me, the cyber domain's a little bit like that, except in the opposite direction as we're pushing forward. And what I hope this report does is capture for us where the community in our region has got to at the end of a year. And I think in Alistair, we've got the embodiment of somebody who is perfectly placed to take us into that uncharted territory. So Alistair, It's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for coming to give the keynote.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Fergus. And I can have you professionally introduce me at conferences any day you like. I certainly appreciate the very warm wrap. Not everyone does give me that warm wrap everywhere I go, but it's nice to be here at ASPI getting it because you play such a critical role. You're right that this report is an exceptional piece of work. It's not only hard work and a huge amount of labour, as you said, to get into each country, to give your opinion, because these are opinions, even with a weighting score, but it shows the critical role that think tanks have in this environment. And we're not always going to agree with your assessments. I do in this case that you put us up in that top pack, and I appreciate that. But it's important that we have people pushing us as public servants, as people serving the public. We need to make sure that there are other ways that we get pressure, not just from our political masters. And so this centre here plays such a huge role, as do academics all around the world in making us do better at serving the public in what is, as you say, such uncharted territory, but territory that we will win in because we have to preserve our way of life and prosperity with these connected technologies. So for those of you who haven't read the report yet or seen press reporting on it, Australia came out well. We moved from fourth place to equal second in what is a tight pack. And I'm preparing ourselves, of course, to say that when there's only 1 or 2 points between that leading pack, we would expect to see movement in there. But I think it's a fair assessment to say that Australia is actually in a pretty good situation. Not perfect, and I'm never going to say that. I don't think we can ever stop in such a fast-moving space where every day people come up with new ways of using technology and new ways of abusing technology. We can't ever stand still. But it is a real pleasure to know that we're up amongst a group of quite impressive countries, whether it's the Japanese or the US or Singapore. It is great to know. But I can say that in this year, since the last report was put out, that there have been significant movements here in this country. And I would say that it's moved in 3 major ways. We have more political pressure to succeed. We have more pressure from business to succeed, and we have more pressure, frankly, from people on the street to succeed, from the citizenry themselves. And I can say that as someone who's been in this space for a long time. There has never been a time in this country where we have that level of pressure to succeed. And as a public servant, you've got 2 choices when you've got more pressure. You can resent it and ask why it is that people are pressuring us to change the way we're doing business, to do more, sometimes with less, but in this case, do more with more because we're getting more resources. Or you can use it to your advantage. And I choose the latter. I choose the latter because it's the right thing to do, to deliver better services for you, because you're my customers, and to do better for the broader people of Australia. Why and how has that occurred? There have been a number of events in the last year that have really steeled the resolve of my political masters, and frankly of business and of the broader community. Frankly, the census failure last year, when a website goes down from tiny denial of service attacks, and the public themselves ask the question of, can you trust government to do digital service delivery? Wow, that's a really big question. Are we resilient enough? When a WannaCry global ransomware incident rips across the world and takes hospitals offline in some countries, affects transport in others, telecommunications providers in others still. And only 18 businesses reporting incidents in Australia, but we expect there would have been more, and there could have been more. But really, you ask yourself the question, were we prepared for those things? Did we respond well? And the answer is we didn't respond well enough. Not at all. We didn't respond at the scale or the speed that people should expect for us in 2017. And then, of course, we hear of political interference in electoral processes, the attempts to use cyber as a means to influence democratic outcomes. I mean, the very fundamental aspect of being a public servant is to serve the Parliament, who represent the voices of Australian people. And so that then brings into stark relief, what are we doing? Are we well enough prepared for those types of things? So that pressure has increased on us. It's increased on us very significantly. We are better today at working with our state and territory colleagues than ever before. I address COAG meetings. I now meet with the cabinets of state and territory governments of all political persuasions. I meet with senior public officials from states and territories who, as you would know in this great federation of ours, don't always see eye to eye with the Commonwealth. They're not saying, how much more can you give us? Where's the money? What are you going to do for us? It's what can we do together to make this place more resilient? There is a genuine shift in the type of conversation we're having. And that mounts pressure on us too, because it's not the same as just coming back from another meeting in government where people are sort of saying, well, let's just have another meeting in 6 months' time to look at the minutes of the last one to see if we maybe should review the minutes in 6 months' time still. It's what's the addressable action we're going to take, and are we going to test it and see? Tomorrow I meet with a particular critical infrastructure area that is vital to us as a community, to have really frank conversations about how we can better test and learn, red team, practice together. You really be ready for incidents that at some point may well hit our community. And if they don't, fantastic. If they do, we've got to be better prepared. These types of things just weren't possible to dream of even a handful of years ago. Certainly I wouldn't have expected a year ago to be standing here saying just how much that pressure has ramped. And 2018 won't be any different. It won't be any different at all. So a few critical things happened to us. The Prime Minister, 3 or 4 months ago, announced the formation of a Home Affairs Department. That impacts us in cyber. On the same day, he said that the government accepted the recommendations of the independent review into the Australian intelligence community. That affects cyber because it talked about the increased role for the Signals Directorate, the concept of moving other parts of capacity of government into that world-class agency. And he mentioned that the Australian Cyber Security Centre would evolve further still. And just last night I was in Sydney opening up one of the, and I should recognise Lyndall here from CERT Australia, who currently heads CERT Australia, opening up one of the joint cybersecurity centres in Sydney. A promise made and delivered. In 1 year so far, in Brisbane, in Melbourne, in Sydney, we've opened up these joint cybersecurity centres, industry-led collaboration spaces where we can not just share threats but solutions to these perennial problems that impact us all. And before the end of the year, we'll open one up in Perth too. And then shortly after in Adelaide. And we're going to Darwin and Hobart somehow shortly afterwards by partnering with people, working out ways to solve problems rather than doing our traditional bureaucratic way of doing business. Never going to be enough. Gay, you should rightly put us to the test and question us, because just like ASPI, and I know you will, so I don't have to encourage you to do any more, but I acknowledge your presence here and I thank you. And that's what it's about. It's about making sure that an opposition asks questions of government and make sure that the public servants that serve that government are delivering for the people. That's our job. And if we don't do a good enough job, tell us. If ASPI decides we're not doing a good enough job, that's their view, and they tell us, and they have in previous reports. But today and tonight, they've said we're doing a pretty good job. I'll take that win. And I'll say to you that I think it's a great credit to this organisation, that the type of resources that have been delivered. Just very quickly, because I know the more important is to hear from the authors and to hear from the audience about what you want to hear. But I'll just say that this time last year, we didn't have an ambassador for cyber affairs in the form of Toby Feakin, your predecessor, Fergus. We didn't have him in that role, actively working in the region, having a gruelling international, and there's nothing romantic about it, a gruelling international travel schedule, taking Australia's views of freedom and unencumbered yet safe and secure internet out to the world. The concept of how we can help our neighbours and friends to fight crime. We didn't have the cybersecurity growth network in place. It hadn't formed at this stage. And yet today, they are active. They are taking scale-ups and startups to the world. They're growing Australian businesses, one of the fastest growing places in any economy in the world. They're taking those and helping us hopefully get an unfair share of that, which is great for us economically. It's fantastic from us from a security point of view to have homegrown solutions to things. The Cybersecurity Centre that is moving to the airport, those buildings, if you go to buildings 14 and 16, you'll see that we've started to occupy one of them. And before too long, we'll be occupying them both. We're moving the Computer Emergency Response Team to be integrated with the Signals Directorate. In a matter of weeks or months, a Home Affairs Department will stand up and we will move together policy people that have traditionally been more disparate in the Commonwealth to work as one to better protect Australian people. None of this was around this time last year. So I'm excited, as you might be able to tell. I'm excited not just because we've had a really big, long year that doesn't seem to be slowing yet, but I'm even more excited by the trajectory that we're heading into for next year. So Fergus, I'm hoping that next year will be even higher with that one extra point or so. I'm hoping also, by the way, that our friends in the region are competing with us to get that spot, because there's no point if others aren't also rising on that same tide. There's no point because of this connected world. It only creates vulnerabilities that crooks and nation states will exploit. So while I'm really pleased to be one of those leading countries, and we will remain that, it's actually incumbent upon us to reach others to help them, because we all swim in this same in the same oceans that only have desert and swamp and ice beyond those borders that we know so well. I didn't study the classics, though I did study arts, and no one said I'd get a job either, Fergus, so we proved them wrong. So look, with that, can I just say congratulations. It's a real report, and it is a point of reference for people all around the world, and ASPI should be very pleased, and I'm honoured that you've asked me to open proceedings tonight. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alistair. That was, I'd just ask our panellists to take their seats, and we're going to segue now into a panel discussion before opening up to questions. Joining Alistair on the panel, we have the lead author of this report, Tom Uren, who is a visiting fellow on secondment from the Department of Defence. He's worked in a whole range of different areas, various analytical and operational areas in defence, and has got a really rich expertise in the internet and cyber issues. And Tom, we're really pleased to have you on the team, and thank you so much for all your efforts putting this together. Our other panellist is Danielle Cave, who's a senior analyst with the Cyber Policy Centre. She's worked previously as an analyst with ONA, as a Google Policy Fellow attached to Harvard's Digital Asia Hub, and has done a stint with the Lowy Institute as well as finishing off her PhD. So,
Still doing my PhD.
You're still doing it?
Tom, I thought as the lead author I'd start with you, and I just wondered if you could give us a brief summary of the report's key findings and any takeaways you'd have for us.
Yep. So I thought I'd start off by explaining why we care in the first place. And I also thought I'd be controversial and actually try and define what cyber means and what cyber maturity means. So for me, my personal definition of cyber is how the internet and information technology affects the real world. And so the key part is it affects the real world. If it didn't affect the real world, why would we care? And Alistair mentioned interrelatedness. And as the internet and information technology becomes ever more interrelated with what we do in the real world and with other countries and other people, it's those interrelationships that affect us constantly. So that's why it's important. Maturity in this context means how a government deals with the challenges and the opportunities that the internet and IT provide. And if you've got poor maturity, you just don't deal well with the challenges or the opportunities. So that's why we care, because it affects everything and it makes a difference. So overall, Australia did well. We improved, and that was because we put effort in. We appointed senior leadership positions like Alistair, Dr. Tobias Feakin as the Cyber Ambassador, and the intelligence review also emphasised, it sort of increased the mandate for the Cybersecurity Centre, and it's clear that we've got a greater focus on cybersecurity from a government point of view. Other countries in the region, in fact the entire region, also improved. What is a bit worrying is that the countries at the top improved more than the countries down the bottom. And for countries with less cyber maturity, the internet and cyber is a great development story. So things you can do on the internet and with IT allow you to at times leapfrog the slow development process that more developed countries have gone through. But there also come a great deal of challenges. So cybercrime, the big one. There's a lot of users who aren't as savvy as us in this room, who will fall for a phishing email and will hand over their banking passwords as they develop. And this puts at risk the development opportunities that exist there. So, and it also allows those countries to perhaps be havens for cyber criminals. So there's small towns in Eastern Europe whose specialty is cyber criminality. I've heard that they've got the largest Lamborghini dealership in the world in a small town in Eastern Europe. And these are the things that we'd like to avoid in Southeast Asia. One thing that came out of the report is that leadership and governments does make a difference. Countries are better off when they put resources and focus into cybersecurity. And we can make a difference by having the right leadership and the right policies in place and working collaboratively. And it has to be a collaborative approach. So my final takeaway would be that the region is ripe for leadership in cybersecurity. So Australia can make a big difference in the region. So there's terrible things that happen, like WannaCry, that we're in a good position to make a difference to how states behave on the internet. And we're also in a good position to raise the level of cybersecurity across the region. It's still, for most people who live in the Asia Pacific, very, very early days. And there's a whole lot of work that can be and should be done to change the trajectory of how the region develops.
Alistair, if I could turn to you, you've had first-hand experience leading the implementation of the government's cybersecurity strategy, and as you note, that's been in part helped us get to number 2 this year. I was just wondering, from your experience living that process and from your discussions with counterparts in the region, what are the biggest obstacles to becoming a cyber mature nation?
So you do need the political classes to want to do something, and we're lucky that this is a bipartisan issue here, that it is supported in the states and territories as well. So the politicians want us to succeed, and I mentioned that. But it's also important that the public you serve actually needs to know that there's something to be solved as well. And I go way back to when I started in cybercrime investigations in the early 2000s, and you know, it titillates people, but they didn't personally know a victim. They hadn't personally received that phone call from the alleged Microsoft employee to tell you that your computer had malware and could they just use this remote access technology to do it. Now, if I asked for a show of hands, everyone would know someone or have received that call. So there's almost got to be a problem to be solved, weirdly. I want to pick up Tom's point and say that if we don't get this right in those developing nations, this is one of those great ways for them to advance their economies and their societies. And it's a great way to harm them desperately if we don't get this right. So you need political leadership and you need that bottom-up approach. Industry has to not just say they want to cooperate with you, they need to actually cooperate. And I look around the room at a whole range of people that I know well from industry, and I know that we're actually genuinely partnering probably for the first time ever, properly partnering. So the barriers are, those things need to be in place. That fertile ground needs to be there. And it hasn't been there before. I mean, a lot of us have wanted to achieve this for a long time. It's not an individual, it's not Toby and I, it's not, you know, Adrian Turner, it's the fact that all of those things are together and somehow we've got something good. Our job, it's incumbent upon us now to be working with the region, using Toby's role and others actively to help others to get there. And then I'd be happy to be in the top 25 or 30 if everyone is better. I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's just, you know, it's not one thing. It's not just launching a strategy. We've had strategies before, and it's not just funding it. We funded things before. It's all of those things coming together, and we're really privileged that now's the time for it, and not before time either. I would have liked it a decade ago, but it's never too late to start being way more focused on this stuff.
Well, you mentioned 25, 30 countries. The aficionados of the Cyber Maturity Index will note that it's getting thicker each year. And this year we added Taiwan. Now, Danielle, you've just been living in Taipei, and so I was wondering whether you could give us a sort of snapshot of what the report tells us about what's going on in Taiwan. And as a sort of chaser question, if you could compare that with what's going on in China, given that it's a territory that China claims.
Sure. Taiwan, I think, was the perfect addition this year into the report, and we also added Vanuatu as well. Taiwan came, I think, rounded out sort of the top 10 at 9th. China just beat it at number 8, and one of the reasons for that was because Taiwan's sort of quite complicated international recognition and the lack of diplomatic recognition that it gets means that it doesn't have the same access to multilateral fora and regional organisations that other countries and places have. So it got really low scores on the international engagement front. But in many ways, it's one of the most interesting case studies because Taiwan really is on the front line of cyber attacks in Asia Pacific. And those cyber attacks are incredibly sophisticated. I was sort of back there quite recently and went around and spoke to government officials and think tanks and some of Taiwan's quite large democracy NGOs. And they talk about cyber attacks in terms of how many they get per hour. And they talk about the attacks in terms of some of the attacks coming in. The attackers are very well aware of where they are every day and their sort of real-time working environment on a per-hour basis. And that's something that we just don't see here in Australia to the same degree. So they're a sort of really interesting addition. And actually, President Tsai Ing-wen, who came into power last year, actually tweeted last night that they just made a sort of suite of new cybersecurity and information security investments. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what comes out of that in the next year or two. And then in terms of comparison with China, they couldn't be more different. So, for example, Taiwan has the highest Facebook penetration rate in the world at about 82 to 85%. Facebook is obviously not in China, and we talk quite a lot about whether they will be allowed in China, and I think most of us think it's quite unlikely in the short term. You know, China sees cyberspace very differently to China. Taiwan sees cyberspace very differently to China. For example, Taiwan's policy is more similar to how we see cyberspace. They want a free, open and secure cyberspace, whereas China pushes out cyber sovereignty into the region. So the two actually provide a great case study for that highlight the different decisions that you could make and different paths you could take.
Brilliant. Alistair, I was hoping to come back to something that you mentioned in your remarks about the shifting architecture here in Australia. The report talks quite a bit about how different countries are setting themselves up in different structures. I was just wondering if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about how you saw these architectural changes here benefiting us in future, especially if we were aspiring for the #1 slot, and whether we're at the end of that process, whether you see this as sort of a continuing process where we're going to be refining and refining as we go forward, or whether this is sort of where we've reached a sufficient sort of level now.
I'll start by answering the latter. What's fit for purpose now in terms of structure may not be fit for purpose in 2 years' time. But I'm not saying that there will be changes in 2 years. We shouldn't weld ourselves into position and say this is it. We've found nirvana in terms of bureaucratic structures because times change, and they change really fast, as we know in this space in particular. Time seems to have a different speed in this space. So I'm not going to say that the structures we've got will be fit for purpose later. I'll say that they are more fit for purpose now for us than what we've had in the past. So a couple of things. we call it, ACSC 2.0. Really, it's a re-engineered cybersecurity centre, where rather than it being, sometimes it was referred to as a place, not a thing, in the past thing, where agencies brought their cyber capabilities under one roof, but they ran them sort of as partners in a process. That the government has indicated what it wants is more of a joined up capability. It might seem like a small thing, but it's important in terms of getting rid of some points of friction and some redundancy and other things. So there's process that we can improve and are improving. There's an understanding that the pure play national security, cybersecurity, nation state threats and other things needs to be on equal footing with cybercrime, which agencies haven't always seen that because we're protecting a community. Most businesses aren't going to care, even though they should, about what nation states are doing. They're definitely going to care if their identities are stolen or the businesses that they rely upon are impacted. So there's more emphasis on certainly not de-emphasising nation states. Let me just make that very clear, just in case there's an implication of that. But that we will raise the profile of cybercrime, things that affect people. So that's an interesting shift. Certainly from a policy side, I can say that we will make sure that the policy, so under the new construct, policy answers to me through a new Home Affairs construct, and the operations side will answer through me in the terms of head of the Cybersecurity Centre. And by virtue of that, we'll make sure that the gap between policy and operations, and there's a logical divide government has in those things, there's reasons for it, we don't allow, again, sometimes it would surprise people to know there can be friction between policy and operations areas. I know it would shock, actually. No, you'd all be shocked. We'll reduce some of that friction because we'll co-locate. We'll have people working side by side, so the operator can turn to a policy person and say, it'd be great if you could fix this. And the policy people can say, we're thinking about this, how's that going to impact you? Wouldn't that be a novel idea in government for us to be able to do that? So we're doing things like that. So some of them are actually quite small. And I don't want to sound flippant about them, but those small things can actually lead to quite dramatic movements. The other thing is, and in your introduction you mentioned the concept of taking risk. Let me say something a little bit controversial since you started, and I'm not known for it, is this. If the model we had in the past wasn't working and couldn't scale and wasn't addressing the problem, then we've kind of failed, right? And when you work in government trying to deal with the volume of cybercrime, the ephemeral nature of it, the jurisdictional issues, there's so many reasons why it's hard to win. So if you accept the fact that the model we had wasn't ever going to do it for us, then you can take the risk to change things, because at worst we're going to end up in the same spot. It sounds almost defeatist, but it's not. It's actually quite liberating. And that is, in this fast-moving space, where technology and the way we use technology and the way people abuse technology has shifted so fast, and it's hard as bureaucrats to keep up, you have to challenge your operating models. And you have to set yourself free of that fear of failure. And you do that by accepting the fact that your current model just isn't going to cut it. And that's hard to do, but once you've done it, it's quite liberating. And I'll wear the risk, as I say to any person that works with me, I'll wear that risk associated with it, because to me it doesn't accrete any extra risk to the Commonwealth. That risk will be realised through inaction. That risk will be realised by us adhering to our old ways of doing business. We will de-risk it by changing the way we do our business. Some of it will fail. We will be rightly criticised by the media, by the government themselves, pretty good at doing that too, by think tanks, and rightly so. And we always talk about this concept of fail fast and learn everything, and it's easy to say until you're in government trying to act as a bureaucrat in it, but I'm happy to take that risk, because the risk of not acting is actually way bigger. So I'm not sure, again, if I've answered your question. I have a policy of never reading questions beforehand, as you know. So as my best shot at answering it, as honestly and frankly as potentially controversially as possible. Let's fail but try to win.
That's a perfect segue to my next question. We've got the Shadow Minister here for cybersecurity, and a couple of months ago, I think you gave your counterpart a bit of a ribbing here for the response to one of the big ransomware incidents we had, and that I think you were referencing there, Alistair. And my question is, we've had WannaCry in this reporting period. We've got WannaCry. We've had NotPetya. that have caused massive damage. For just 3 companies, the total cost was over $1 billion Australian dollars, not Australian companies. So my question to the whole panel is, are we going to see other big attacks in 2018, and are we better prepared as a country and as a region to respond to them?
Yes.
Yes to both, or just yes to the first?
I'll deal with the first, and you can.
Oh, so that's the easy one.
Yeah. So I think I'll say yes, because saying no in this audience would be pretty boring. I'll say yes because it's clear that certainly North Korea is interested in making money. So they've had a number of attempts to steal $1 billion from banks in the region, and they're still trying. And in the Bangladeshi case, I think they spent several months operating in the bank before they actually tried to steal money, so they really did their homework. Ironically, they made a typo, and they spelt foundation wrong, and that was what tipped people off. But they're clearly out to get money. They'll try something else. WannaCry has also been attributed to North Korea, and that seems like another money-making venture gone slightly wrong. So tremendously destructive, but not very good at actually making money. So they'll keep trying, and I think it's highly likely that we'll see something that will either affect the banking system very badly or affect the internet in some other way.
No, I agree with you. And to sort of segue to a slightly different point, I also wonder a lot about the attacks and the breaches that we don't hear about in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And I think that will only, continue next year. I think Australia has a much better reporting regime, and developed countries, one interesting thing Tom and I talked about is how, if you look at the ranking, it aligns quite closely with GDP. So I think one thing to think about is, in our closer region, particularly in Southeast Asia, how can we encourage governments a little bit more to be more transparent in collecting and producing that sort of data?
So I'm going to agree that there will be major global incidents similar to the ransomware campaigns we've seen. It's a no-brainer. It's an easy crime for people to commit, no matter who the offender is, a nation state or criminal groups. And it's possible there would be a more targeted, catastrophic thing that happens in a place like Australia. It's a numbers game, right? So yes to the incidents, and yes to our preparation. I don't think we should ever say that we've achieved greatness, as I said in my introduction. But we'll do a damn sight better the next time there's a WannaCry than the last time. And that's that introspection thing that we've put ourselves through it. Not fun as agencies to sit around and say, so how do you reckon we went on the Monday morning afterwards? You've got to have some, because people are just doing their jobs. I mean, we're well-meaning people. Everyone in this room, you go to work thinking you're going to do the right thing. But suddenly you're struck. So we've based our responses, and Mike Rothery was one of the first people that talked about this concept of the all hazards approach. We should treat cyber as a hazard, just as we have a bushfire or a cyclone or a flood. It makes sense, yeah? So we've got these mechanisms in government to cope with those things. We've got a crisis coordination centre, you have responsible ministers, you go out and communicate. That's good, except the hazard that we encountered on the morning that WannaCry started spreading was different to a cyclone that you can predict 4 days out on the coast because of a low pressure system and whatever else, or a bushfire because it's a low humidity day, high wind, high temperature. Suddenly, in not just one spot, but potentially thousands of spots across this country, this thing could have impacted us. I mean, we're kind of lucky it didn't. The government's called it a near miss. I've said it was a near miss. Could have impacted us horribly. Really horribly. And you can't predict it the same as you can a lot of our natural hazards. You just can't. So the all hazards approach works to a point where we just say government can do this grinding thing and manage an incident. How do we manage 1,000 of those? How do we communicate out to the kebab shop on the corner and to the big business down the road? Because they're all linked. They're all part of the same ecosystem. And one of the things we've really been talking about this year is this supply chain issue. So, you know, one person's business relies upon another, either as a contractor or a supplier or something else. And so yeah, we'll be better at it. That I'll tell you. We'll be better at the messaging. You know, you compare us to some other. I don't want to benchmark against other countries. The UK did it better than us by a mile. The New Zealanders did it better than us. I mean, Gay points out quite eloquently and dramatically so. But I don't want to just be where they're at, because that's not good enough either. They couldn't communicate out with the same people that we know we need to touch too. So we'll radically change how we do it, and we'll learn. So by the time we get into our blissfully non-event ridden Christmas New Year period, we will make sure we have some, where not a single cyber incident will occur. We'll be ready if it does. Better than we were this time last year, and not as good as we'll be in a year's time, or a month after Christmas. And we are running. And I look around at some of my government colleagues, Chewie, hello, and Linda again, not mentioned. And I know it's painful. It's painful every meeting you go into and say, we're not doing good enough. Is that the right language, by the way? Good enough? Well enough? We're not doing well enough. We're not moving fast enough. We've got to break what we're doing. And that hurts for people who are good at their jobs, trying to do what they're paid to do. Long answer to your question.
I know, I really appreciate the ambition and going out on a limb on that.
Oh, well, I have to review what I said now. I'm worried.
I had a little bit of a chaser for you. One of the exploits that was used in the ransomware attacks was Eternal Blue, which was linked back to the NSA in the US. I'm just wondering whether that trove of exploits that came out is increasing our chances of having a destructive attack, or whether it's unrelated and we've just got very increasing regional capability, for example, through North Korea's hacking teams there.
No, I don't think our risk is increased by that. Let me try to put it in colourful terms that I'm sure people will misinterpret. It's a bit like firearms on a street. If there are stockpiles of weapons out there, and there are people developing new exploits all the time. There are exploits, frankly, sadly, you don't need new exploits often to do anything bad. There are a lot of systems unpatched for vulnerabilities we've known for years. Dirk could use the most simple technique that's been around since 2005 to break into some systems. So he doesn't need some weapon or exploit stolen from a government allegedly, for example, to make his crime any worse. Because frankly, we've got vulnerable systems. We haven't got some of our hygiene in place, let alone sophisticated protections against things. So there's a lot of upside to what we're doing. So no, I'd say to you, it's unfortunate if tools used allegedly by Western democracies to do good to defend their communities get into the wrong hands. That's not good. But it's not like there aren't tools out there already being actively used or created by those who will do us harm, whether they're nation states or criminal groups. They're very good at doing that themselves. So no net increased problem for us. Kind of cute if it was one of ours used against Western nations. That's nice of whoever did it. But there's plenty of other vulnerabilities, plenty of other exploits, plenty of other nasty people who are really smart and prove themselves faster than us every other day. Our job is to get hygiene right, some basic discipline right. ASD's top 4 and Essential 8 give us a good example of what we can do, aspirationally, really hard to do in reality. I'm saying this, Chewie, for your benefit, as one of the people that authors those things. So blame her if you're from government departments and you find it hard. We can meet with Chewie later. But what I'm saying is that they're aspirational hygiene things, but that's not enough, because our staff act as the vector for attack often. We get tricked by people. And it was nice to think that we are better protected against phishing emails theoretically than other countries. I'm not sure if we are. We've got a very trusting population who likes to click on things, open attachments, visit websites that are dangerous. We all do. It's what we do. We're conditioned to do that. So we've got human failings that our enemies, and I'm going to say enemies in terms of nation states who are quite properly doing their things, and criminal groups who are quite improperly doing their things, who are going to exploit those things forever. And so 1 or 2 tools that may or may not have come from our friends is not going to make it a worse problem. It's a long answer. I'll make the next one really quick. I promise.
Do you have anything else to say?
I would actually say, yes, it did increase our risk, but then I would actually agree with everything that Alistair said. So, and it increased our risk just because there's very capable tools that were out there to be misused. Now, having said that, I don't think that it was a bad idea to have those tools and use them. I think that's a kind of decision that a government makes about a short-term gain versus a possible strategic long-term threat that they could cut off. So that's a very hard decision to make, and organisations struggle all the time to trade off tactical and strategic. So having said that, everything Alistair said after no was correct.
Thank you.
And I actually, even though we started off from a totally different position, I think we pretty much agree that there's a whole suite of other problems that relate to security that are unrelated to those particular exploits. There are, in fact, both good and bad people developing exploits all the time. There've been, I'll just segue into talk of, in the States, of not developing exploits, and I think that would be stupid. That's the equivalent of unilateral disarmament. Governments need those capabilities at times to do things. Yeah, I think that's all I have to add.
I mean, one of the things I was thinking here, Tom, is what I found interesting in the report is you pull out this idea of the development of, or what you're starting to see is a trend of sort of buying and applying ready-made kit, essentially. And I think that's speaking to some of what you were saying, Alistair, that there's now the ease of carrying out cybercrime is much easier than it was even a year ago.
So, was that a question?
Yes. Take it as a statement.
So, what we found in the report was that everyone's cybersecurity is getting better, but also the threat landscape is getting worse. So, because things are getting better, people are actually investing the effort to try new ways of attacking you. And those new ways can be really tremendously successful. So there's, I'm not sure if it's trying to outrun the bear or if it's a balancing act, but there's some really good analogy that I haven't found yet that we're trying to beat back attackers. Yeah,
it's a space
This is
desperately
convoluted as one of my efforts. So you can come and work with us any day you like. Thanks.
It's a space desperately in need of more metaphors.
Of more tortured metaphors, absolutely. You're in anytime you want.
We might open it up to questions from the floor now, and we've got a roving microphone here. So is it with you, Jack? Yeah, great. Okay, just let your hand up and Jack will come to you. Brendan.
Hi there. Brendan Nicholson from ASPI Strategist. And Alistair, we had some communications while I was still working with the Australian a year or so ago. If the North Koreans fire a missile at a country like Australia and land it on a creche and kill 50 orphans, then that's an attack. If somebody sabotages a piece of equipment and the consequence is that people are killed, an aeroplane crashes or a centrifuge explodes or something like that, then presumably that's an attack. Going back to the census issue, we were all scrambling around to try and work out some language to describe what had actually happened. And I can remember talking to you, but a lot of people were talking at the time, and we didn't have a clue by the time it got to deadline time whether what happened with the census was an attack or not. How do you define an attack? And where does it start and finish?
So we've just published the first version of what we call the cyber lexicon, by the way, which was a direct result of a recommendation I made to government stemming from my review into the e-census incident of August last year. And when you look up YouTube at the press conference we did, it was a classic 101 of how not to talk about cyber incidents. Which was great because I was part of it. So what happened at that press conference was interesting. Minister McCormack was right. He said it was neither a hack nor an attack. It was neither. There wasn't a hack. It wasn't an attack in the way that the intelligence agencies and the Department of Defence and our military would refer to it. When you say attack to them, you duck your head, right? Because you think someone's shooting at you or doing something aggressive like that's going to cause some type of kinetic harm to you. He was right. I stood up, David Kalish stood up as the chief statistician, and he didn't talk at all about it was a hack or attack. He just said your data was safe, and he was right. And I stood up and said it wasn't a hack, but it was an attack. Which was great, because I'm surprised you, as a journalist, didn't come out of that room knowing exactly what had occurred. Because all three of us were right, and all three of us were using a totally different language to describe the exact same event. It was an attack because it's known as a denial of service attack. It's just not an attack in the terms of the way the intelligence agencies and military talk about it. So we've published now, and look, the great thing about taking technical terms and trying to put it in normal people speak, because that's the people we're trying to speak to, right? The community, because they've got to have confidence in government. The minute you start starting to define some of these things, everyone, you can imagine the debates that occur. How many bureaucrats does it take to debate the phrase attack or cyber, to use your classic one? We do debate the word cyber. We debate a whole range of things, whether it should be hyphenated or not. There's a whole chapter on it. But it's important. Language matters. Language matters because if we can't communicate the issue so people understand it, how do we respond as a society? So it sounds trivial, but it's not. So we've published the Cyber Security Lexicon. It's our first crack at trying to popularise language. So who wrecks it each time? Journalists, the political classes when they talk about things, because they don't use the type of boring language we give them, because they need colour. Vendors and people that solve our problems for us have to change the language every time because they've got a solution for something we didn't even know existed, like a new medical condition. So we change our definitions each time, and we add a new word each time, and what we need to do is go back to basics and say, what's an attack? Short answer is, I don't think Australia has ever suffered a true cyber attack. And by the way, we wouldn't have to respond with cyber even if it was a cyber attack. We could respond kinetically, diplomatically, or some other way if there was indeed ever one. I'd also say to you that in April 2016, the Prime Minister, when he launched the strategy and announced changes to do like my role, he actually said that Australia has an ability to conduct cyber attacks. And that's true attack in the term of the word. And since then, the government has said that we use cyber effects and attacks against a range of people, including terrorists offshore. And most recently said that we would look to do that against criminal groups operating offshore too. But all within the laws of war and armed conflict and all of the other laws that have to be applied for those types of activities, so that we don't cause harm to people that don't deserve harm. And it's a really tricky area, and it will evolve really rapidly. But at least we're talking about it. We're talking about the frameworks we use. There are a lot of lawyers in those things, and we make sure that we do the right thing. But you're right, it's hard to define. I'd urge you to look up the lexicon. You can be like readers 6 to 30, and give you feedback, because I want to hear the feedback. But if you want to give me 5 pages in 3-point font why a denial of service attack needs to be defined differently, I promise I'll disregard it. It's got to be adding to our ability. And the last thing I'd say, sorry, God, I said I'd be quick, is I was actually on a phone call this morning talking about the lexicon. It was an international philanthropic? They don't make stamps, do they? They're the others.
It's philately.
Okay, they weren't those people. Though a stamp would be nice. People that give money away to help with things. And they said, we're really keen on this lexicon thing. I thought, wow, they were reader number 6. And they said, we're worried about the imagery associated with the words. And if you put those words into a Google image search, look at the types of images that come. White men in hoodies, green 1s and 0s on a dark background. Good you didn't do it. We need better imagery. And I said, brilliant. I'd love to partner with you as we try to change the define the definitions. Define the definitions, yeah. Okay, define the words. How do we get the imagery around it so that the public can start seeing? And why do we ask the public what these words mean to them? Because I can go a top-down approach, but I'm telling the public what they already think about something. Tell me what you think, and let's debate this. And it really matters, words. You know that as a person that writes them.
Thank you.
Long answer. Sorry. Next one will be quick.
Or
promise.
depends how you define it.
Yeah, exactly. It's quick to me. It was 10 minutes. That's quick.
Yes, down the front here.
Thank you. My name's Hilary. I'm from the Department of Defence. I'm interested in your comment about the disparity between those at the top improving and those at the bottom not improving at that same rate, and a bigger difference between their cyber capability. And then also the comment of the role of governance. And so in those states at the bottom of the chart who have that absence of governance aiding in their cyber security and so on, what role can Australia and other regional leaders play in bringing them up with them? What sort of concrete steps can they take in the absence of their own state governments performing that?
Lead author.
So I think so the report covers countries as diverse as the United States all the way down to the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji. And some of the countries, especially in the Pacific Islands, but also Laos and Myanmar, the telecommunications infrastructure is still being deployed and growing. And especially for the Pacific Islands, there's sometimes not a whole deal of actual internet connectivity. So from a cybersecurity point of view, there's this kind of chicken and egg problem. And we really don't want connectivity to really leap ahead of some sort of cybersecurity posture, even if it's something simple, just like awareness that phishing exists. So it really depends on what country you're looking at and what state they're at, because they're all different. So perhaps somewhere like the Solomons, getting better connectivity would be good, and partnering that with some sort of public awareness campaign perhaps would be the thing to do. Whereas another country that has perhaps really good mobile phone coverage, maybe some sort of aid that would actually improve broadband and perhaps law enforcement at the same time. So it would depend. It really depends where each country is at, and I think there's a solution. There are solutions for all of them, but for each one it's different. Was that all? Yeah.
We have a question at the back there.
Hi, I'm Heidi Winter. So it was great to hear about how your upcoming critical infrastructure red teaming exercises are going to be discussed. It definitely is a good representation of cyber maturity, as programs like that require a pretty mature security posture within an organisation to be effective. So, Alistair, you spoke about taking more risks moving forward and adopting more modern practices. Do you see, or when do you see the Australian government adopting more modern programs such as crowdsourced security services, for example, managed bug bounties, or the widely successful USA's Hack the Pentagon?
So I subscribe to the wisdom of the crowd. The first indicators of WannaCry weren't in the mainstream media. They were on social media hours before. And you can look at how that pops up. We've got to be smarter, by the way, at looking at those things, what those lead indicators are, and picking the ones that are going to get big versus the ones that don't. That's hard, but we've got to get smarter at that type of thing. BugCrowd, an Australian company, by the way, that's so successful in the United States. You talk to Casey Ellis, the founder, saying about how, one, they wanted to go there as part of their life journey and experience, but people like Casey, frankly, want to come home too, because I think life's better here. So firstly, the world's, I think, most successful, or one of the most successful, citizen-driven, or sort of that type of harnessing the crowd is an Australian thing. We probably don't use it as much in Australia as some other countries do, and I think we'll get smarter at that. each country has its own quirks. We can be a bit more conservative in some areas. Having lived in the United States, they're highly conservative in other parts that we just consider as normal, right? That's the beauty of travel. So yeah, I'd like to see us using more innovative ways to test. I mean, let's face it, the crowd tests our systems every day anyway. They're just not always in an authorised way and not always as friendly as you'd hope. There are flaws in bug bounty systems. You make the assumption that the person who finds the really good exploit tells you all of them. But they can find them anyway. That's the great thing about the internet. They can come after us and test us, and they do. Maybe not, well, actually, yeah, by the numbers by the day. Lots is my official number. So, look, the public's already testing us, and our friends offshore, criminal or nation-state-wise, are testing us too in really good ways, and they win from time to time. It'd be nice if we could harness that energy for good. I would say to any youth out there that there are ways we can harness your skills, not just working for government, but hopefully testing us in that great way. And I love that innovation of Hack the Pentagon and other such things. I don't want to just replicate what other countries do. There are unique things Australia can do that won't be better, they'll be different. And you'll see us do those things. The number of, when I think about the cybersecurity challenge that was run by ASD and Prime Minister and Cabinet over the years, there was one challenge. Now there are multiple capture the flag competitions and other ways to get students engaged and others. And just in the last 18 months, I was having a meeting about that. Strangely, I was having a meeting just yesterday on the same topic about all the things we're talking about, lots of meetings. We were talking about the explosion in the number of these things. Did we need to be doing it anymore because there are others doing it? Wow, the maturation of the market is just phenomenal. Our job is to harness it. Sometimes in government, in counterterrorism, you expect government to lead, right? It's the job. It has the monopoly on the use of force and all those other things. In cyber, our job is to lead, but I think more importantly to sometimes get out of the way, sometimes to curate, sometimes just to help create an environment that allows others to flourish. It's much more complex and frankly much more existential in terms of the threat to us. There's no doubt. And we'll get smart at harnessing those things. It won't be perfect, but we're way better than we were this time last year. And if we were chatting, if you invite me back next year, we'll be better still. And I'll still be telling you we're in a rush.
Great.
Was that quicker?
Wait, yeah.
I'm taking his answer.
We've got.
we were agreeing with each
I have one more question over this side. I think was that gentleman here. This will be our last question. If I just wait for there's a mic coming if you like.
So, Tom Eddy from the Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. I love the lexicon. I have actually seen it. It's great at simplifying a lot of terminology that small businesses find incredibly obtuse and hard to navigate. And so much so that they find the term cybersecurity really scary. So, there's a lot of effort that we see in simplifying those terms, stuff like multi-factor authentication down to two-step authentication, those sort of things. What is ACSC recommend for small businesses to take note of? If the Essential 8 is too complicated for a small business to follow their maturity model, what is their first step?
So you work with Kate Carnell?
I do.
Yeah, I love Kate. And Kate, frankly, holds our feet to the flame about what we're doing for the millions of small businesses in this country, the backbone of Australia, right? And all those small businesses, by the way, do business with bigger companies, and in a supply chain world, we can't leave any part of the community unprotected. Frankly, what we do at home matters to what we do at work as well, whether it's BYOD, because we're bringing that into a bigger system, or whether we expose ourselves in some way by our private activities, reusing passwords, or by our personal predilections that then can get used against us as in our public lives or our work lives. So everything matters. And Kate does a great job, by the way, of sometimes putting her finger into my chest and saying, why aren't you doing more for small business? So I'm a real pleasure to see you here tonight. It's tough because we know it's hard for big organisations to do the top 4, let alone the Essential 8. We know it's hard for medium-sized businesses to do it. I think a lot of this has to be designed out for small businesses. I actually put a lot of stock increasingly upon the role that telcos and ISPs need to play, and other providers to small business. It should be that as a household or a small business, that I can actually, not as an add-on, but as part of the service that I get, that someone has filtered out stuff for me. I'm not talking about censorship, I'm not talking about clean feed, so please don't, I'm not talking about that type of thing. I'm talking about known bad not coming to my inbox to start with. That my ISP doesn't let me go to a known phishing site that it's known about and doesn't allow its own employees to go to, but it allows me as a customer to go to. I mean, really, what we need is that type of scale. Now, if I said that a year ago, people would laugh at me, and the telcos in particular would say, no way. And I can tell you now that the CEOs of telcos say, yeah, we get it. We get that we've got to start offering that type of service. So I think a lot of this is going to come down to ISPs and telcos. A lot of it's going to come down to hardware and software manufacturers who sell you a generic thing, a laptop or a surfacey thing, and built into it is going to be security. Built into it now in some of those devices is free encryption software, ubiquitous encryption, so at rest and on the fly this stuff's happening. And some of it's now coming free with virtual firewalls and other such stuff. And that's just going to be more and more commoditized. So that the small business owner worries about their behaviours as opposed to the technology threat. So we can then talk to them about how they should act. This is the same way if someone came knocking on their door saying, by the way, you owe me money, you don't just pay them. You don't do that. You don't just pay them when they come to you on the web, or when someone does something slightly dodgy offline, your red flags you see, same online. So we need to design out these threats because it's too hard for a small business, and it's too costly. And frankly, the threat evolves so fast. We need to either have those services provided by, if we think about the defence contractor recently that received some publicity, defence subcontractor that was compromised. They worked to a prime, they worked to a bigger defence contractor who either should have provided a security service for them as part of their contractual arrangements or assured themselves that the provider had those arrangements in place. And I prefer the former. I prefer saying, look, if you're going to do business with us, we're going to drop these sensors on your network. We're going to put you behind our gateway because we want to make sure that the traffic coming into you doesn't harm us. And we just got to be smarter as a community to do that. I don't know the solutions, but I know that if this was anything else, if this was happening offline to the rate it's happening online, we'd be really solving the problem. And I can say that the politics has shifted here, and the mood of the public has shifted such that people want those types of answers. And we'll explore them, we'll test them, we'll work with industry in a way that we've never been able to do before. And we'll make sure that we're not bringing our own prejudices as to what can't be done to that table. And we'll ask people for stretchy solutions. And I think in a year's time when we're talking, we'll have in place some of those things that might have seemed like a dream a handful of years ago.
Great.
So Kate can be happier with me, which would be good. Let her know.
Alistair, Tom, Danielle, thank you so much for giving your time to offer those insights on this report today. I just asked the audience if you could, thank you for coming, and if you could join me in thanking the panellists and doing our